Hello and welcome to lesser known alien encounters from Brazil. As we all know, Brazil is considered quite a hot spot for UFO activity. As such, a while back I made a video about some of the more popular UFO encounters found here, but as usual, I wanted to uncover some of the more lesser known ones. I have to say that I found some really weird sightings that very easily could have fit into my Strange Alien Encounters series. As a heads up, I dug so deep for information that many of the articles I found were actually written in Portuguese. So due to differences in translation, I had to really figure out what exactly was being described. In saying this, I may have misunderstood something, and I hope my viewers from Brazil can help me correct any of my errors. I also wanted to mention that I take great care to pronounce names correctly the best I can. As such, you may hear names like this, which you may naturally think is pronounced Jose, but in Portuguese it is actually said as Jose. I normally don't mention this in my videos, but I felt the need to address it before I inevitably received the typical "you said it wrong" comments. Without dragging this out, let's look at a few of these strange encounters. Our first story was said to occur in the small town of Bairro Sagrada Familia, which is located in the city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil. On the night of August 28th in 1963, three children would encounter something that would change their lives forever. After eating supper, the 14-year-old Fernando Eustáquio Gualberto and his 7-year-old brother Ronaldo and their 7-year-old friend and neighbor José Marcos Gomes Vidal left the house between 7 and 7:30 with the purpose of cleaning out the family's coffee strainer. This was a common task that involved the boys utilizing a water tank outside that was located near a cistern. From what I could gather from reading the original translated report, apparently Jose started washing out the strainer. Ronaldo was behind him, and Fernando was hanging out near the house. All three boys found it odd that even though it should have been dark outside, there appeared to be an odd glow illuminating the property. It was at this moment that Ronaldo looked up and saw an odd circular craft hovering over a nearby avocado tree, and it was responsible for producing the eerie light. It was described as being 3 to 3.5 meters in diameter. The sphere was divided into a series of small squares like a checkerboard, and it had an odd antenna on top of it made out of 3 separate rods. Now, what made this craft even more unique was the fact that it apparently was completely see-through. Due to this feature, Ronaldo stated that he could see 4 crew members inside, with most of them sitting on one-legged stools and appearing to be operating the controls for the craft. The crew member in the back was a male that was heavy-set. In the center seat was a woman with long brown hair that was pulled back. In the front seat was another man who was thinner, and between these two was the 4th member, who wasn't fully described. All crew members wore a brown shirt, white pants, long black boots, and their heads were covered in a transparent dome type of helmet. Ronaldo claimed that they all appeared to be around 6 feet tall, and oddly enough, they only had one eye in the center of their heads. Suddenly, 2 yellow beams of light shot down from below the craft, and the 3rd member of the crew, who wasn't described, was seen almost floating down to the ground. At this moment, both Ronaldo and Fernando were frozen in terror at this sight, but poor Jose was still unaware of what was going on due to having his head inside the water tank, still busy cleaning the coffee strainer. The alien visitor appeared not to notice the other 2 boys and started to walk quickly towards Jose. As the being neared, it extended its arm as if it was intent on grabbing the unaware boy. Finally being able to break through his fear, Fernando tackled Jose to the ground in an attempt to save him. The creature stopped moving and started to look back and forth from boy to boy. It then began to make gestures with its hands, and it produced noises from its mouth that was apparently its language, but the boys couldn't understand it. Being they were so close to the creature, they were able to see that it had reddish skin, it was bald, its eye was large and completely black. What also was apparent was that this presence was much taller than originally thought, and it was said to stand higher than a doorway. The being then took a seat on the edge of a cistern and still tried to communicate with the children. Fernando took this moment to slip behind the being, where he picked up a brick with the intent of hitting the visitor with it. Just as he raised his arm to throw it, the being suddenly stood up, faced him, and shot a yellow beam of light out of a rectangular object on his chest. The light hit Fernando's arm and caused him to shake, which in turn made him drop the brick. After this, it was clear that the crew members on board the ship were communicating with the one on the ground, since he frequently stared back at the craft. Even after this attempt of aggression, the being continued to try to communicate with the boys by making numerous hand signals that appeared to be circles, and he was indicating that it had something to do with outer space. Finally, he pointed towards the moon, turned around, and started walking back to his ship. Jose asked Fernando if he thought the creature was ever going to return, and as if he had heard the question, the being turned around towards the boys and made several vertical movements with his hands as if to answer the question. The being then grabbed a flower from a garden of one of the nearby houses, walked under the craft, made a hand signal, and began to ascend back up the two light beams that had just reappeared. The craft then produced a bright light and shot off towards the east. After the encounter, the three boys ran into the Gualberto residence. Jose immediately ran and hid under one of the beds, while the other two relayed their story to their mother named Medea Jose. While she had been unaware that anything was going on at the time, she did notice a bright light through the window at the same time the craft flew away. Medea even stated that the light was not caused by the headlights of a car, since the flash was at a window that was behind the house. Due to this story being presented, Medea sent a neighbor girl out to the local bar to retrieve her husband, named Alcides. He rushed home and was shocked to hear the story that had unfolded. Alcides then went outside to investigate the backyard, where he did find large boot prints in the dirt that were placed there by something very heavy. Hearing of the event, a neighbor named Jamil visited the household and saw the prints in the dirt as well. Although much like other encounters through history, the townsfolk mainly poked fun at the family and refused to believe them. Even though the visitors never returned, it is worth noting that the boys no longer wished to be outside when it became a certain part of the night. Now, a lot of people outside the area have assumed that the boys had to have seen a TV program in which they based their story on. The interesting part to this is that the town was very poor, and none of the families owned a TV. In fact, many of the homes were described as basically being just a shed. Our next story comes to us from the town of Pinedo, which is located in the city of Pirassununga. At 7:30 in the morning on February 6, 1969, many townsfolk saw what they claimed was a bright-colored UFO landing in the nearby forest. A woman named Medea dos Santos first saw the craft hovering in the air 2 to 3 meters above the forest for a while before it finally descended. This woman's neighbor, a 19-year-old boy named Tiago Machado, saw the craft as well, but he originally thought that it might have been a blue parachute. With this in mind, he decided to investigate the area, but before making this venture, he visited his friend Francisco Hanser and asked him to join him. It is worth noting that many of the locals saw this craft, but were not as excited to find out exactly what it was. Tiago grabbed a pair of binoculars and started a difficult trek into the jungle. At one point, he and Francisco split up to try to cover more ground. Tiago made his way through the dense forest, of which it made visibility really difficult. As such, he was unable to see very far ahead of him, and only when he was about 10 meters away from the unknown object was he finally able to make it out. Not much description of the craft was provided, but it was said to be of a roundish shape and was silver in color. As soon as Tiago neared the craft, a doorway opened up and two beings that stood about 5 feet tall emerged, and two others were seen standing inside the ship. They were said to be wearing silver suits from head to toe, with a clear panel being present where the face was. In mentioning that, their skin was a yellow color. They had yellow eyes that didn't have a pupil, their lips were thin, had a flat nose, and they all had a distinct scar on both of their cheeks. In a situation that is very reminiscent of our previous story, The creatures stepped forward and immediately tried to converse with the young man. They did this by producing deep bass-sounding noises and using hand signals in the form of circles. Tiago asked them where they came from, and they seemed to understand his language, since they produced more circular hand signals. Apparently comfortable with this encounter, Tiago decided to light up a cigarette while watching the beings. Not being an ungracious host, he threw his pack at them. Now, due to poor translation, I'm not sure exactly what happened here, but it appears one of the aliens cautiously picked up the pack, and apparently it held it to his chest and absorbed it into the suit. Then the other two beings smiled, showing their black, irregular teeth. With this interaction, the remaining two members of the ship rejoined the other two. It was at this moment that he decided to remove his binoculars and attempt to give them to the beings. This did not go over well, since they immediately withdrew closer to the ship. Things calmed down, and the beings continued trying to communicate with the young man for a while, until they were startled by the sound of Francisco calling out for his friend. At this sound, the beings quickly returned to their craft, all the while not turning their backs on Tiago. For some unknown reason, the last being to enter decided to shoot out a blue beam of light at Tiago, and it hit him in the right thigh. This injury at first tingled, but then started to radiate throughout his body. Tiago watched as the ship silently lifted off and shot off into the sky. Finally, the pain from his leg was too much, and he passed out. An hour later, he awoke to find himself in the hospital, still with pain in his leg and with an unquenchable thirst. Later, it was reported that Tiago's neighbor, Medea, had seen him enter the forest. But 40 minutes later, a young boy came running by, claiming that he had found a young man's body and feared he was near death. Medea and another woman, along with the boy, found Tiago's body and said he was lying face down with his eyes open, his skin was pale, he was sweating profusely, and kept repeating the words, "water." They took the man back to their house, where they noticed the odd wound on his leg that was similar to a scar from being whipped. The women alerted the police, and they took him to the hospital. If I read the report correctly, it says that after this encounter, Tiago suffered from insomnia, hysteria, and would enter periods of catatonic states where he would stare off continually, blinking. There was no word on what happened to his friend Francisco. I mention this since you would have assumed he would have found Tiago before anyone else. When the site where the craft landed was investigated, they found that in a 4-meter diameter area, the trees had been bent over, and on the ground there were 3 indentations where the landing legs had been. Moving on, we find 2 odd stories, but I have a feeling that they may be linked. Near the town of Crisima, on November 18, 1957, a man named Pedro Zili and his friend Jean Gidnerny were busy building a greenhouse on his property. At around 10:30, the men were alarmed to hear a weird hissing sound that almost resembled that of a tea kettle, but extremely louder. Even though it was strange, they really didn't pay it much mind since they were focused on their work. 20 minutes later, Jong ventured near the forest to gather some more wood for the project when he noticed something odd in the valley below. He called out to Pedro, and the men both saw 2 saucer-shaped silver craft resting on the ground amongst a grove of orange and eucalyptus trees. The pair began walking down the hill to get a better look, and it was then that they also saw the pilots of said craft. In total, there were 6 beings that had a medium height, they wore gray clothing, and had white hands and feet. At the sight of Pedro and Jong, the beings quickly ran to their ships, with 3 members entering each one. As they rose into the air, 3 more craft that had been hidden emerged from the trees. Apparently, the force from the craft's engine was so strong that it actually bent over the trees. Within mere seconds, all 5 UFOs had vanished from sight. Now, our final story is somewhat similar to the previous one in a few aspects. In the municipality named Itabarito, 3 men had a strange alien and UFO encounter. On August 30th, 1962, a group of men named Geraldo Liberato, Luis Gonzaga do Carmo, and a third unnamed individual were hanging out near a local theater at 11 p.m. talking about the movie they had just seen. During this conversation, they heard a loud hissing noise, and when they turned their eyes skyward, they saw a silver saucer-like craft hovering near a eucalyptus plantation 50 meters away. Giraldo then alerted the group to a weird being walking towards them that he claimed was the size of a large doll. It was described as being around 1 meter high, having short arms, a small head, and oddly enough, the body of the Michelin Man. The creature walked steadily towards the group, and once it was 10 meters away, it abruptly vanished from sight. Giraldo and the unnamed man ran away in terror, but Luis stayed where he was, finishing his cigarette. I am sure in this moment that he made this decision either because he couldn't believe what he was seeing, or he seriously had nerves of steel. After 2 minutes, the being rematerialized and began producing a light that was so brilliant that it illuminated the entire surrounding neighborhood. At the sight of this, Luis decided to call out to his friends to see it, but he inexplicably found himself unable to talk. Not only this, but he was completely unable to move any part of his body. This lasted for over a minute, and he could finally move after the creature dimmed the lights it was producing. Luis put his hand to his mouth to grab his cigarette, but found that it had vanished. No other details were provided as to what happened next, other than that the article states Luis suffered from severe headaches weeks after the encounter, and no form of medication was strong enough to ease the pain. I have to wonder, assuming the story is true of course, if Luis actually was abducted at some point of the encounter. As I end this, I know that some of the details in the previous stories were a little out there, yet when it comes to topics like this, it seems to come with the territory. Even as such, I am curious about your thoughts on them, and I hope you enjoyed this video. So, join me next week as we venture to Louisiana in our Cryptid by State series. And as always, remember to keep voting for which states you would like us to investigate next. If you haven't yet done so, do please consider subscribing to my channel for more content like this. Also, it would be greatly appreciated if you share my videos with someone you know who may enjoy this type of genre. With that, be safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.